I'm sitting here with Christine Klaas, who's an expert on iron ocean fertilization. Christine, maybe you introduce yourself. Where did you start in science? Why did you go into science? And how did you discover ocean iron fertilization?
Okay, so first I'm a biological oceanographer. I work at the Alfred Wegener Institute. And my link to ocean iron fertilization is that through my PhD and work after my PhD, I was able to participate in the 3 ocean iron fertilization experiments that were led by Viktor Smetacek. That is Isonex, IFEX, and LOAFEX. My interest in oceanography dates from my teenager years. I grew up in South America, actually, mostly in Brazil, walking barefoot in the bush there. And I was always interested in animals and collecting animals and things like that. And then after that, I went to Venezuela and I had the opportunity to go to the Caribbean a lot. And I did a lot of scuba diving and fishing and so on. And from then on, I wanted to become a marine biologist, but then life is never so linear. So I ended up, because my family is Swiss, studying biology, classical biology in Lausanne in Switzerland. But I always looked around on possibilities to do marine sciences. And through that, I did a stage, a training period. And I ended up in Viktor Smetacek lab here in Germany, in North Germany. And after that, I went back, finished my bachelor's, did a master's in the Polytechnique in Lausanne. And then I contacted Victor and I decided to come here and work with him as a PhD student. After that, and there I started really working in Southern Ocean plankton, but more sort of descriptive ecological aspects. And after that, I did several postdocs, and among other with a biogeochemist at the University of Chicago in the US. And he was doing these models of the carbon cycle. And he was actually looking for a plankton ecologist to improve those models. So he was more looking at the impact of iron on glacial, interglacial atmospheric PCO2. And that's very much related to the ocean iron fertilization as a mean of sequestration, because the processes are the same in some way. And after that, I came back and really started working on, with David Archer, my focus was more glacial, interglacial cycles and modeling and data analysis. And after that, I came back here and started really working again on the plankton and on the experimental side, but also with this background of global modeling of the carbon cycle. So basically combining the different disciplines. That's more or less my background.
And you were part of 3 ocean iron experiments. How did they go from your point of view? We only heard Victor's point of view so far, but it must have been an interesting journey.
For me, it was a bit the same journey as Victor. So when people came up with this iron hypothesis, I was also skeptical, because at the time, the background from my PhD was more working on the grazers. And we thought that it was more a combination of low light and grazing that controlled the plankton. And usually biology is complicated. So when I heard, oh no, it's just a bit of iron, I was like, it can't be possible. It cannot be that simple. But participating in those experiments, it was pretty clear that yes, it's that simple. Actually, you add iron in the Southern Ocean and plankton starts growing and you get those blooms. So yeah, it was an interesting experience. And it was also very exciting because it's the first time you could study perturbation of a natural system under natural conditions. So not taking samples out of their environment, putting them in bottles, in incubators, and also isolating them from other organisms within the community. So you had really the natural reaction of the whole community without any perturbation other that you added a bit of iron to the system. That was I also liked the most about these experiments, because doing experiments in bottle is very nice, but nature is not a bottle. And I think it's sometimes dangerous to extrapolate what you find in a bottle to a whole ecosystem.
I mean, bottle's contaminated, so...
Yeah, but I think you'll find the natural system behaves differently than what you see in a bottle.
Yeah, true. And most scientists only do research in a lab. They never go into the big field, the ocean.
Yeah.
So what was the moment for you in which you realized, oh, this works really, really well, And what was the moment when you realized that also maybe other parts of the science community do not really agree with you when you're sort of in a pioneering position?
First, we were the ones looking at plankton. So this is what I do. This is what I'm doing now. So we take samples, we fix them, and we count and we look at everything that's in those samples. And I had this experience because I did that for my PhD, so I know Southern Ocean sample. And when I saw these experiments, I realized that the communities we got through iron fertilization were the same than the communities that bloom naturally there. So it was not that we were profiting one species more than the other because we added iron, but the community reacted the same way it would have reacted if the iron had come from dust or from land inputs. And the other interesting thing is that for each one of these experiments we do, we always had a different community. So it was never exactly the same community. The species you find are similar, so they're the standard species you find in the Southern Ocean, but which one became dominant changed from one experiment to the other. And all of these three communities are, in terms of their dominance, of which species dominate, are communities that are characteristic of blooms in the Southern Ocean. I love those experiments. I think it's not just about carbon sequestration, it's much more that with these experiments we could learn so much more about the system also, how productivity, how species composition changes, how export, what are the processes that lead to export that are natural processes. And like I say, you can't do that, replicate that in a bottle. Personally, if I could, that's what I would be doing all the time. I mean, huge scientific value, those experiments.
And since you looked at species so much, which species in your experience has maybe what sinking capability, which sinks like maybe just a few meters, 10, 20, 30, which makes it to the ocean floor, which is especially tasty or yummy for which zooplankton? There were only 3, but maybe there were also other experiences. So which species is sort of the mostly contributing to the ocean food web in which area that you explored?
So that's a difficult question, because if we knew that question, I think we would have the answer to our problems. The issue is that, like I said, in the artificial experiments, we every time had a bit different communities. These were experiments, first, of very short duration. We did our experiments very far away from land masses because you don't want the interference of the iron that comes from the land masses. So you want to be sure that you're in a place where there is no iron and then you add the iron. So what I'm doing now is looking at natural communities in natural fertilization settings, so close to islands like South Georgia. And there we find, again, the same species as before, but their proportions change. And there are a few species which we find now, which we did not find in the open ocean experiments. So now you see that from our OIFs, there are differences from one experiment to the other, which may be due to simply seasonal difference. In the case of LoAFX, is a bit special. There were no diatoms because there was no silica. So I'm not talking about this one, but Eisenex and IFX, there was silica. And like I said, 2 different communities, possibly because we did the experiments at different seasons. And then you go to areas which are continuously fertilized by land masses. And there you get something different, which is more the dominance of these Chetoceros species, which are these coastal species. The other thing, what you're interested in is not so much which species are there, but what happens to them and do they sink. Now, if you look at deep sediment traps, you'll have also large differences where you're close to an island or where you're far away from an island. And usually you have more fluxes close to islands, but what you see in those sediment traps is actually what sinks down is spores of certain species of diatoms. These are called resting spores, so sometimes it depends on the species, but for instance, when nutrients are used up, they form these spores, which are with thick cell walls and are very resistant, and they're heavy and they sink en masse. And for instance, this type of species we did not observe during IFEX and ISENEX, because those are more typical of areas that are close to islands and that are fertilized continuously. So what I'm interested in is really to understand in terms of the iron fertilization regime, so one area that's fertilized all the time compared to another area that's fertilized from time to time, and see, do you have differences in species that are reproducible and how the carbon is exported in these systems.
So especially the silica layer to me is an interesting question. So if you look at the silica cycle in the ocean, you'll find some areas of the ocean where there's low silica, and we know that there's like a silica layer in the Southern Ocean, but which other areas around the world have like high silica? Where does silica come from? And then most interestingly, if you take like a diatom or a non-diatom, so a non-silica microalgae, how do they behave differently?
Diatoms are different from other phytoplankton because they have this wall, which is made up of silica, and it's a rigid wall. And so they can grow only in environments where you have silica, and these are usually areas where you have upwelling of deep water. This is the Southern Ocean, mostly equatorial Pacific, and the subarctic Pacific. There is also silica in the North Atlantic, but there are differences in concentration. So the Southern Ocean and the North Pacific have very high silica concentrations. The North Atlantic a little bit less, and the equatorial Pacific also less. So you have also different dynamics in terms of the silicon cycle between these different areas. And what's specific about the Southern Ocean, but it's also characteristic of the North Pacific, is you have these diatoms with very, very thick shells. And because of these thick shells, they also sink faster. So they consume a lot of silica, and they also take out a lot of silica out of the system. And those are different than the ones you see in the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic has less silica and a lot of iron. And therefore, in the North Atlantic, you have species which are similar to the ones you find in coastal areas. Whereas the North Pacific and the Southern Ocean have these very specific species with these very thick shells that grow relatively slowly and take the whole silica out of the system. When you compare fertilization in areas where you have silica, that means you can grow diatoms, and areas where you don't have silica, so diatoms cannot grow, what we see is in areas where you don't have silica, there is not much export. So all of the productivity gets recycled in the surface. So to really have export of carbon, you need the diatoms. Without the diatoms, it doesn't work efficiently.
So some people would argue that some of these non-diatom microalgae then get consumed by grazing, so consumed by zooplankton and contribute to the ocean food web. And I think there's these interesting two paths that the carbon can take. The carbon can be stored in the diatoms and sink down to the ocean floor, or the carbon can be stored into non-diatoms and get eaten by zooplankton, which then get eaten by fish, and then some of the fish the humans don't eat, right? So a whale or a seal or a dolphin we typically don't eat. So you could assume that this carbon is safe for as long as this animal is alive. And then some of these animals also sink. And if they defecate, some of the carbon also is deep down enough. So maybe what's your personal view about these sort of two carbon cycles, one by sinking the algae and one in the ocean food web?
I think it's not the correct way of seeing it, because it's not either or, because carbon is not limiting, right? What's limiting is iron. So if you have an area which is fertilized by iron, well, like the whole Scotia Sea, Antarctic Peninsula, all these areas, this is where you have the most krill. But this is also an area where you have a very high export at depth. So it's not a either or situation, because if you have iron and the algae grow faster, even if they sink, there will still be more food for the krill. What needs to be recycled in the system is the iron. The carbon is one part is eaten, one part sinks. But if the grazers recycle the iron there's always enough phytoplankton to produce more and more and more. So carbon is not the limiting resource. Do you understand what I mean? It means that as long as iron is being recycled, the phytoplankton can always grow and still fix carbon and continue fixing carbon, even though part of it is eaten by the food web. So you're not just directing the carbon in one direction, but it goes in both directions, and you keep the system turning by keeping the iron at the surface. That's how it works.
What do you think is the permanence in these like low silica or no silica areas of the ocean where you have like very, very little diatoms and where like the recycling just happens in the surface level, or if it just happens in the ocean food web? Is it that we have to look at the lifetime of whatever fish is consuming the microalgae? Is that the factor? And is there any sort of model that you could create, and that much algae get consumed by that much fish, and these fish store the carbon for that period of time? Or does it relate to like another factor?
In the end, in these systems, what's important is they should be at steady state. So you cannot take out more of the system than what you put in, which means in these systems, there is a bit of flux, but this flux is always compensated by input. So what you're talking about is what we call oligotrophic systems. So with very little nutrients, how much comes up is balanced by how much comes down. And you need this balance, because if you don't have the balance, the system is going to lose nutrients, and at some point there will be nothing left. In these systems, you probably have an equilibrium between grazers and the input of nutrients. And it's just fine-tuned to a different level than what you would have in the Southern Ocean. These are complex ecosystems, and at some level they regulate. It's like on land. If organisms start eating too much, they starve. And so they die, and then the food can grow again until they're grazed again, and then they starve. And with time, you get a sort of equilibrium situation where both equilibrate to maintain the system at a certain level. And in oligotrophic regions, this level is much lower than in high productivity regions. But if you look at fisheries, most of the fisheries occur in areas where you have high productivity. So the large fisheries occur in upwelling areas, west coast of Africa, west coast of South America, west coast of the US. And these are areas that are always supplied with nutrients through upwelling. This is where the big fisheries. Nobody goes fishing in the middle of the Atlantic. There isn't much to fish there. The fisheries in these coastal nutrient-rich areas.
Speaking of equilibrium, so humanity has killed around 3 million whales in the last 200 years, which were a great source of iron. So I read that a whale on average defecates 7 to 12 tons of iron over its lifetime. How much did we hurt the balance of iron in the ocean by removing the whales as an iron source in the Southern Ocean, but also other areas of the ocean that whales were active in? And is it fair to say that a whale is somewhat of a gardener, pooping in its ocean eddy in which it likes to swim around and creating its own algae blooms, and therefore creating its own zooplankton bloom and creating its own food, so growing its own food in its biosphere?
I would argue, yes, you can say that. It makes sense because whales eat at the surface and they defecate at the surface. And of course, they take up carbon to make the blubber, the fat they need, and the rest goes back into the column. And because the defecation of whales is liquid and there's certainly organic matter, so they probably contributed to keeping the iron in the surface. Whereas now that you have less whales, the diatoms take the iron, die, and probably sink out. I mean, we don't know what happens to this krill really. Where is it going? There are good reasons to assume that, whales had a really important effect. But again, they're gone. So you cannot study the situation before where the whales were there because they're not there anymore. That's the problem. We don't have good baselines for that. How was the system before? It must have been very different, because I think if you calculate the amount of krill that's available now, there is no way that the krill you see now could have sustained the population of whales you had before whaling started. There must have been much more krill there, which means there must have been more productivity, And now, through our experiments, we know that iron is the key element. So the dynamics of the iron in the surface layers must have been different. We work also by analogy. So if you look at land ecosystems, we know that large organisms like elephants, they are called ecosystem engineers. That means they shape the system. And the whales were much bigger than elephants, and also in terms of biomass, more important. So they must have shaped the system in which they were.
One argument I'd like to make to people who oppose iron ocean fertilization is that essentially it's not really fertilization, it's more like restoration. So we killed so many whales, we got the whales and the iron out of the system. It's only fair for humanity to restore something that it damaged and add as much iron to the system, so limit the iron addition to the amount of whales that we killed. I think that has to be studied and modeled out, and obviously we are far away from reaching any significant amount of iron addition, but theoretically it could be calculated, like how many blue whales used to be in the Southern Ocean, and then if they have more krill, how much could we impact their reproduction cycle? So unfortunately, their reproduction cycles is much slower than with other fish. So sometimes I wonder if
Not slow. They grow very fast.
So how fast could we make them grow back? That's the question. And if there's more krill because we add the iron, would whales grow back faster than other animals? Or how long do we have to wait to get all the whales back that we killed?
Well, normally their calves grow very fast, I think a few years only. So it doesn't take long. But the point is that they haven't grown. They haven't increased. The blue whales have not increased. And that means the system, the way it is now, cannot sustain these whales the way it was before. So something got taken out of the system. And it's probably iron.
So how many blue whales do we have left?
So about 1,500 in the Southern Ocean. 300,000. And now there are only 1,500. Whaling stopped somewhere in the 80s. And now it's like 40 years later.
Still there.
And they haven't changed. So there's something in the system that's missing. The system does not allow these whales to increase in numbers. And we think it's iron and the way the whales influence iron dynamics, and therefore also krill and phytoplankton production. But we don't have a real number. That's the problem, because the system is gone. You have no data on how the system was. We can have estimates, but we don't have the system as it used to be. It's gone. It's lost.
So what's so interesting for me about the whale question is that people love whales. There's so much funding and attention towards whales, and whale restoration is a completely non-controversial topic. There wouldn't be anyone who tells you, please do not restore the whale populations. 99.9% of the people would love that and would immediately permit it. But there's just a very tiny intersection of people that is knowledgeable about the connection between iron and whales. So if I'm working as an activist, let's say I'm working for Sea Shepherd, and Sea Shepherd has this mission of we need to stop the krill ships, the krill farming, because that krill is supposed to be eaten by the whales. How can we explain to Sea Shepherd that they could actually serve nature really, really well if they would not only stop the fishing, they would also increase the krill population? So there's like two levers that you have. Stop the overfishing, stop the killing, but also feed the krill, which would then like feed the whales. So if you get like 20 minutes in a room with like someone from Sea Shepherd, do you think you can convince them? Do you think you can change their mind? Or is it because it's an organization that has like a history and sort of like an operating modus of being against something, that once you are like, your profession is to stop things, that you never start things, and you're basically wired to stop things, but you never want to start things because adding iron is like starting something rather than stopping a boat?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have no experience working with this kind of organizations. I think you need to talk to them. I mean, really explain. And also, I'm a plankton ecologist. You would need people who work with whales and really have a discussion. What can we do about whales in the Southern Ocean, and what would be the best approach to do it. And I think there's a difference between just going now and throwing iron in the Southern Ocean expecting that it's going to take up CO2. That's not what we are talking about here. We're talking about doing the science and support doing this kind of science. If we do this kind of experiments, we're not hurting anyone. I mean, iron gets taken out of the system very quickly. Our experience in the field is that it has actually a positive effect. We saw a positive effect for the phytoplankton, but we saw also increase in growth rates and reproductive rates in the zooplankton. We also know that all of the mammals and birds that live in the islands, like South Georgia, all the subantarctic islands, they live from iron fertilization. If there was no iron fertilization from these land masses, like the Antarctic Peninsula, the South Georgia, the Kerguelen Islands, there wouldn't be this amount of penguins and seals and birds in this island. That's what they live from. They live from iron fertilization. They wouldn't be there if there was no natural iron fertilization. And I think that's what people need to understand. Without iron fertilization, you wouldn't have those organisms there. You would have no penguins, you would have no seals, no whales, nothing. Because you would have no productivity and you would have no krill, or at least not the stocks you have now.
And I know you're studying this right now, so maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your study that is focusing on these areas that have natural.
Yes, so what I'm trying to look is at natural fertilization to see how the communities in these naturally fertilized areas, growth and what the carbon export is in these areas as compared to the areas where we did our experiments. So like I said, where we did our experiments, we fertilized once. But these are areas that receive hardly any iron, whereas the areas I'm interested in now is areas which are fertilized all the time naturally, and try to see what kind of diatoms grow there, how fast they grow, are they exported, how much krill is there, how much zooplankton is there, and all of that. So how the whole community in these areas are, as compared to the iron fertilization experiments we did. And like I said, this is all very preliminary, but what we actually found is that at least downstream of South Georgia, we had the highest standing stock of phytoplankton, some of the highest in the planet, actually, enormous amount of algae. And what was interesting is they were growing extremely fast. The other interesting thing is that we saw all of them growing. So in contrast to the open oceans where we didn't have growth rates at the time. So now we are able to really measure how fast each species grow in the water column. So that's going to be a whole new set of data. And I think it's going to...
How fast is that? What's like the replication rate per day? Or how many grams of carbon?
Once a day. So around. In these really iron-rich areas, they can divide once a day. But it's cold, huh? Don't forget, it's like 2 degrees or something, 4 degrees. And these rates are the maximum rates that were measured in the lab with full light, nutrients, ideal conditions. So they grow really fast there in a natural environment. What we are also trying is looking at the fluxes at depth, how much of this comes down, which species come down, what form, is it resting spores, so this resting stage, or is it just because they die and they sink, like we saw in IFEX. So in IFEX, we saw this massive sinking of mostly 2 species, and it looked like they had sort of died. So they just died and disappeared. But like I said, if you look in island systems, what you see is not so much these dying diatoms, but more these resting stages, which are resistant stages that sink. So that's the other aspect I'm trying to do now, is putting sediment traps in different regimes and trying to look what comes down and how, under what form, and then combine that to better understand the impact of fertilization on carbon and export fluxes.
And how does the landmass fertilize the ocean? So how does the iron become bioavailable at the surface level?
So the iron is more bioavailable there because you have first input of fresh water from glacier, and there's a lot of iron in rocks, and it's brought into the water and dissolves there. And the other is through a sediment process from the coastal sediments, because when you degrade organic matter, you create, for instance, acidic conditions that help the iron be sort of released in the water. So there are several different processes. If you look at measurements, you see often gradients in iron concentration from land masses towards open ocean. You see also in the physiology of the plankton that they're much happier, have more chlorophyll. There are several physiological markers that you can use that show that they're iron limited or not iron limited, and you see these differences also. The only issue with iron is that we know the chemistry of iron very little still, and iron is not soluble in seawater, so people up to now have been measuring iron in dissolved form. But what we believe is a lot of the iron is fixed by the biomass, is in the living organisms. And probably most of it is in the living organisms. That's where the whales are important, because by feeding on these organisms, they release this iron that's trapped in biomass. So what we were trying to do is also look not only how much iron is dissolved in the water, but how much iron you have in the living organisms, because they are probably the main reservoir for iron in the system.
It's so interesting. I've never thought about it like that. So if I'm a reviewer and I'm trying to give you a hard time, what would a reviewer argue what would be an alternative explanation for the phytoplankton productivity? If I'm skeptical about the iron hypothesis, if I would like to steelman it, what would they say to sort of criticize that type of work?
In our case, there isn't much you could say, because we have different lines of evidence that the iron is the important thing. We do bioassays, for instance, so we take the community and we add iron and we look if they grow faster. And if they don't, you can say, okay, they have enough iron. We also look at the other conditions. So in our case, for instance, for South Georgia, all the nutrients were there. So there was no nutrient limitation. And we do these bioassays with iron, with vitamins. So we test all the possible limiting nutrients. And we look if by adding those, the cells grow faster or not. And when you see they don't react because they're replete, then you can say, okay, they have everything.
Have you ever discovered any evidence that validates other micronutrient co-limitations in the Southern Ocean, like manganese, or is it still
so that's one thing we looked at. We don't have the data yet, but we added manganese also. So we tested that, but it seems at least close to South Georgia, there's no manganese limitation either, from what I heard. But like I said, the data is still not really analyzed properly or published. But yes, we looked at all possibilities. We also looked at production of domoic acid. We had pseudonetia in all of our blooms. So we took samples for domoic acid. So we tried to cover really all the aspects. That's why these studies are multidisciplinary. So we have a group of 53 scientists. We have chemists, we have physicists, we have physiologists, we have planktologists. We're working with zooplankton, with phytoplankton. We really try to cover as much as you can, given the logistics constraint. I mean, Polarstern, you can take only 53 scientists. So we also collaborate with people that cannot go on the cruise. We take samples for them. We work hard.
That's so fascinating. How is it traveling on the Polarstern? Do you enter it from Ushuaia or do you go through the Atlantic?
Yeah, so our cruise, we boarded in Cape Town and we got out in Punta Arenas. So because we were trying to look at this impact of these land masses and look at different regimes again, far away from the landmass and getting closer and closer to the landmass to see what the differences were as you get closer to the landmass, and of course, as a consequence, get more iron input and more regular iron input.
And how many weeks did you spend there?
So this cruise was 1.5 months, more or less, 6 weeks, I think. So it was one of my shortest cruises. Usually they're 2 months, so 8 weeks. And it was 6 weeks because we didn't get more Polarstern time, so we could have done it longer. But of course, you have sort of allotted slots for your studies, and the ship is in high demand, so you have to do with what people give you.
So about domoic acid, what are the preliminary results? What did you find?
So for this cruise, I can't tell you, to be honest, but for the other OEFs, we measure just background values. Of course, you have to keep an eye on domoic acid because we don't know much about domoic acid either, to be honest. But the species that bloom, if you're south of the polar front, really in sort of this Antarctic regime, none of the species we know bloom there are known producers of domoic acid. And like I said, in our measurement, the species that are there, they've been cultured, some strains in the labs, they do not produce domoic acid or very, very minor amounts. And again, in our OEFs, we never measured any significant amount of domoic acid. If you go towards the north in the subantarctic zone, you might have more producers of domoic acid, but in terms of fertilization, this zone is not that interesting because there is no silica. It's low in silica.
And did you also measure other greenhouse gases? Because there are some people that argue that ocean fertilization is a zero-sum game because you would then make algae grow that decompose and release greenhouse gases that actually have like a higher climate impact than carbon dioxide. So is it species specific that some algae are more like fragile than other algae, or what did your...
To be honest, this just doesn't make sense. No, we didn't, because it simply doesn't make sense. Because that means that all the blooms in the Southern Ocean, which are natural, would be producing greenhouse gases. Which doesn't make any sense, right?
It's maybe one of these stories that other scientists like to argue so that ocean fertilization doesn't really happen in science, or to make an excuse why we aren't doing it.
So in our artificial fertilizations, we did measure and we didn't find it. Now, I was studying a natural. These natural are not big greenhouse producers. I mean, we know that. That means all the natural blooms in the ocean would be producing greenhouse gases more than taking up CO2. This doesn't happen. I mean, we know it doesn't happen. So it's a non-issue, I think.
Yeah, so some scientists basically doubt the existence of the biological carbon pump. For them, it's like everything's a zero-sum game, and they like to bring out this argument of decomposing algae.
Are you talking about the oceanographers?
There's like a class of scientists, and I'm not going to name names, but it seems like they like to use the most scary view of a study, or the most scary view of ocean iron fertilization, in order to obtain more research funding. So they would argue something that creates like a headline with like domoic acid or other greenhouse gases, to argue, okay, this has to be studied, and to create like a profile, to create a little bit of fame and be interviewed by reporters so that they can maybe raise more funding for the institutes. Maybe you have a point of view on that, but to me it seems more like a marketing strategy to exaggerate so that you get more funding. So basically that's sort of the incentive.
I don't know. I mean, I think, of course, when you find something new, you want to show the world that you found that. And yeah, scientists tend to think that what they do is the most important thing in the world. I'm not going to go criticize that. I can just tell you my attitude is look at the big picture. You can measure something at one point, but extrapolating from your little measurement here to the whole world, you have to ask yourself, does it make sense or does it not make sense? Like you said, making blooms by adding iron would produce more greenhouse gases than taking up greenhouse gases. Like, look at the world. Look at the islands, the impact of the islands like South Georgia, the whole Antarctic. Look at the Scotia Sea and tell me if it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. That's my approach. So get out of your little thing and look at the world and think by extrapolating what you're doing to the whole world, where it just makes sense. It doesn't.
Yeah, I agree. If you were to argue against artificial ocean iron fertilization, which of the arguments do you think is most valid? Where do you think the skeptics have the strongest points? Which angle do you think would have to be explored the most before you actually start deploying? Maybe you start with 100 or 1,000 tons, but before you go into the 10 or 100,000 tons of iron, what data would you like to see before that would happen?
Well, I think first we need more studies to see what the benefits are. Personally, with what we know now, I think it's mostly benefits. you would have. But before you do the studies over larger spatial and temporal scales, it's very difficult to quantitatively say what are the benefits. I don't see a lot of issues at the moment based on our studies and what we know from natural fertilization. But of course, you need more long-term studies and see, are there real large benefits? Are you really going to get much higher export or not? And of course, how you're going to affect other areas. Because the Southern Ocean is the hub of nutrient distribution for all other oceanic areas. And when you take out nutrients in the Southern Ocean because you fertilize with iron, that means other areas are going to get less nutrients, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be aware of that. Just out of the blue, with what we know now, I don't see any issue in doing more experiments and much larger experiments.
So for the topic of nutrient robbing that you just talked about, so Viktor Smedečić explained that there are some nutrients that are stuck in the Southern Ocean, like circling the Antarctic. So free resources that are non-productive or very low productivity because the iron limitation. In my point of view, using a resource which is not used by other parts of the ocean would be the first one to tackle, because there you had very minor influence on the other parts of the ocean. And I think his estimate was something like 2 billion tons of carbon. Then there's like this continuous upwelling. Is that also sort of your estimation?
Yeah, I think you could do that, but that means it would depend where you fertilize. For instance, if you fertilize close to the polar front and you take all of the nitrate, this is nitrate that feeds, for instance, equatorial upwelling areas or other upwelling areas. If you do it in the Weddell dryer, the effect would be different because the Weddell dryer doesn't supply as many nutrients to other areas. And this is where you have bottom water formation. So the nutrients, they go down in the deep sea and are unused. So I think you need to strategically also think where you're going to do that. And you need to use models to do that, both experiments and models. So it's possible. The other thing is we're having such an issue with climate change. So the question is it better to do nothing? What's worse? Try and do something with maybe some side effects, but are those side effects worse than climate change? That's the question we have to ask. And the other thing is, for instance, you can also compensate. So I remember reading a paper where they say, if you fertilize the ocean, there'll be a decrease of 3% in fisheries in the equatorial Pacific. And I say, yeah, but that's not the reason why not to do it, because these areas are overfished. So if you reduce the fisheries stocks in the equatorial, how about reducing fisheries there also? So you compensate for this side effect.
Now leads to a very interesting perspective. So if you look at, for example, islands and island nations in the Pacific, for example, Nauru, there's Tonga, Tuvalu, a little bit of the Marshall Islands, Micronesia. So some of them seem to have a very, very high nitrate concentration due to upwelling and are so far away from any landmass that I believe they must be iron limited. And these island nations, some of them are sinking. So some have maybe 20 years or 30 years left before they're underwater. So some of the islanders are getting relocated to Australia or to New Zealand. And then most of these islands really depend on fishing. So something like 1/3 or 50% of their GDP is based on their own fishing, but also on giving out fishing licenses to foreigners. So I wonder, do you believe that ocean iron fertilization could work on these islands in order to increase the fish yields or the ease of fishing for the locals, not for the foreigners that it is licensed, but that the locals can actually also get some fish, and that a lot of these islands, they're largely dependent on foreign aid. They don't really have a good business model because they're so isolated from the world. So fish is kind of the only thing they have. So the easier it is to fish for the natives, the better the life quality, the higher the income for them. So I wonder if they actually, of all the countries in the world, have the strongest moral case to do OIF and actually take those nutrients, because A, they're sinking, and B, they depend on fish, and C, they don't have any other opportunities. Plus, a lot of them made deals with the West or like other countries that were not really fair because it destroyed their natural habitat because of overfishing. And now was this problem with like phosphate mining. So there was a lot of harm that was done to them. Have you ever like thought about that or looked into it?
To be quite frank, no. I mean, this is really out of my expertise area. But I think that as far as fishing licenses and all of that is concerned, this concerns their exclusive economic zone, which is this 200 nautical mile zone. And there's nobody that's going to prevent them from doing iron fertilization if that makes sense, which I can't say because I don't know much about these areas. But if iron is the limiting, you would need to test that first. Then there's nothing that says they shouldn't or couldn't do it. I mean, it's their exclusive economical zone, so you can do aquaculture, and as part of aquaculture, as far as I'm aware, you can add iron. It's called replacement. I think they have a special term for that. I can't tell you if it makes sense scientifically, but I don't see why not.
I mean, if anyone in the audience is working on that, we'd love to look into this and encourage to do the research, because we couldn't find any research in these areas. All the research, obviously, in the best locations, the best technical locations, like the Southern Ocean, maybe part of the Arctic, but then those areas, they're so far off, they just haven't been explored for ocean fertilization.
Yeah.
But they might have governments that are actually very friendly to ocean fertilization and aren't as hostile as, for example, maybe the German government or the Canadian government or the Australian government. So the issue that I'm seeing a lot with ocean fertilization is that all the best spots to do ocean fertilization are regulated by very rich, wealthy nations that they aren't really impacted by climate change as much. Like Germany will not sink. Climate change will not be a huge problem for Germany in the next few decades, but it's going to be a big problem for like these island nations, for like Kiribati. I mean, those are going to sink. Like they really have an impact. So probably their incentive is much higher.
The issue with iron fertilization is, first, it's not going to compensate for our emissions. So the estimates are that you can take maybe 1 petagram per year through iron fertilization, and we are emitting 11 petagrams per year, 10 or 11. It's only 10% of what we should be cutting off. It's not much. It used to be more when we were at 3 petagrams, but now we are at 10 petagrams. You need to reduce emissions. There's no issue with that. And actually to zero, because the thing is, the ocean now is taking up more CO2, but if the CO2 in the atmosphere decreases, it's going to release the CO2 it's been taken up. So the effect of putting CO2 in the atmosphere, they're not going to stop when we stop emissions. They're going to continue. And I think it's this transition time. That's where things like iron fertilization can help. But it's not going to help now if we continue emitting. We have to stop. There's no discussion about that. Now, as far as these nations are concerned, there might be a benefit for them in fertilizing with iron for fisheries. But if you really want to take up CO2, you have to fertilize the Southern Ocean. There is no other option. There is no area that has as much nutrients and that's big enough to be taking off carbon. So the issue of iron fertilization for island nations in tropical, subtropical areas is more managing resources, maybe fisheries, but it won't help much in terms of sequestering carbon. I don't think so.
Obviously, these are much smaller areas and the nutrients are less. And also the fish will be eaten, right? So whatever extra fish grows, that carbon is going to be released again. What other differences are there, like a technical difference between the island area and then the island nation, Pacific island nations and Southern Ocean, just from a carbon sequestration point of view?
Again, it depends what is the nutrients concentrations, what you can expect. I imagine a lot of them are really relatively poor in nutrients. I mean, because it's blue water. Other than that, just doing the science, I mean, having the possibility of making the observation and the study, the infrastructure, I would say. Not for the fertilization itself, it doesn't demand high infrastructure or anything, but gathering the information and the data that demands a certain amount of commitment and scientific infrastructure and manpower also.
We would have to support that. Other oceanography institutes would have to support that.
Exactly.
Maybe you have a few more examples outside of South Georgia. So what other natural ocean fertilization happens? Dust storms are one of them. I've also heard about forest fires in Australia. Have you looked into them, or how do all of them compare? And to me, it's almost ironic that people that oppose ocean iron fertilization research, technically, they would also have to oppose a dust storm, which is occurring naturally. So they are not really protesting dust storms, they're just protesting the human version of it.
Yeah, I think it's this attitude that when we interfere with nature, things go wrong. I mean, there's this belief that, for good reasons also, that when we start interfering with nature, we make things worse than it was. But through climate change, we are massively interfering with nature. We are trying to do this to mitigate that. And the question is, which one is worse? The other thing is there are also interventions that did have a positive impact. Not all our interventions have a negative impact. People have to weigh this and perhaps been shown more examples of positive, where we intervene with positive impacts. These examples are rare because they are not talked about in the press. A typical example is the introduction of dung beetles in Australia. Now, Australia has still a problem with flies because of the cattle that was imported from Europe and because there was no organism that degraded the feces of the cattle. So they have this fly infestation. So they introduced dung beetles to get rid of the problem. They didn't get rid of the problem, but I think it helped at least, no? So so I think there are examples of that where we intervened and improved things. And I think iron fertilization, you're not adding to the system, you're more allowing the system to use the resources that are there. We're not eutrophising the system. We're not adding nitrogen or phosphate. We're just adding iron to allow plankton to use this nitrate and phosphate. And also maybe compensating for the whaling that was done before.
Yeah, it's something that I always love to explain to people, that iron is a micronutrient. So the ratios between carbon and iron in most algae species, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is something like 1 to 50,000, 1 to 100,000. Yeah. So it's a trace nutrient. There's like a tiny amount is needed. So you could argue the system of the ocean is actually almost complete. Everything works perfectly. And you could switch on the system, but there's this tiny bit of micronutrient missing that is like the turn on switch to make things productive. And that's all what we're adding. It's not a huge modification.
And the question is, what are our options in the future? Personally, I think we've already passed the point where we can have nice discussions and think we can preserve everything the way it was. That's gone. It's like the whales in the southern Earth, they're gone. So either you want them back, that means you have to do something about it, because the system is not coming back by itself.
Yeah, I would love to see ocean iron restoration happening, especially as a sort of fish and whale solution.
Yes.
And with that sort of small, like 10% climate benefit. I do see that there is more activity. There are like more researchers coming out and basically saying, maybe we should reconsider our point of view on ocean fertilization. What's interesting though is that the Europeans aren't really participating in it yet. So if you say basically there's XOIS, like exploration, ocean, iron fertilization, it's mostly like American based and maybe some like Japanese scientists part of it. Why is the Alfred Wegener Institute not allowed to give resources to ocean iron fertilization experiments anymore?
There's no question of not being allowed. I think for what you're talking about, the American consortium, I am part of this consortium actually, and I've attended a few talks, so I sort of try to keep informed what's going on. Where I think we can help and make an impact, of course, we'll try to do it, at least from my side. But right now, I think with the studies I'm doing, like this island impact, also these sediment traps I'm doing, I'm contributing to the same question, just in a different manner. And I think the work, to be quite frank, I'm doing now is really important. and it's not being done. There are very few studies, and I think it's an important basis also, not only to support iron fertilization, but also to improve modeling, for instance, of iron fertilization. So yeah, we're not doing the experiments anymore here, but we're still supporting the same science in a different way. And like I said, I am in the XOES email listing, and I see they have their meetings. It's usually a bit late for me, but I keep myself informed of what's going on.
Yeah, what I was trying to hint at actually is that Germany signed the London Protocol, London Convention, and sort of ratified it, while maybe the United States did not. And from what I understood is that one of the impact of this memorandum was that the German research institutions were shying away from giving out resources for that type of research, like the Polarstern, which is like one of the best, I think, research vessels in the world, is not allowed to do that kind of research anymore. Is it correct, or is it?
No, it is actually. The London Convention, you can see it in different perspectives. From a lawyer's perspective, what a lawyer would tell you is it actually established the framework. So you could do these experiments legally without issues, like the issues we had during LOAFEX, which means the London Conventions allow you to do these experiments. It has a framework on how you can apply for permission. You have to apply for permission through them so that you could do your experiments without controversy, in a sense. But the whole procedure to do that is extremely complicated for us. And it's very difficult to have a ship time allocated to you on a procedure that can take a lot of years. And it's quite complicated. So in a sense, in practice, it's very difficult to get a ship for an iron fertilization experiment where you have to go through this whole procedure with the London Convention to get it approved. So it's not like impossible, it's feasible and it's legal. If you follow the procedure, it's just make it very difficult for us because it's a bit out of sync with the realities of how you can get a ship for such an experiment, what are the timelines, what are the constraints. But I think if you do it in a sort of international context, the way, for instance, you're talking about XOEs, the way they are trying to do it, you could do it. I don't see a German team with a German vessel doing it on their own, but in a sort of international collaboration, it would be possible.
Do you know of anyone who has ever tried to apply for like a permit from the London Convention, London Protocol?
No.
From what I understood, the barriers are quite high for the observation you have to do before and after your experiments. So maybe you can only get the Polarstern for 6 to 8 weeks, I guess, but you would require to have it for 2 years or 3 years full time. Is that the conflict?
Yes, you would need to have long-term observations before, which is already difficult because that means you need a ship to go there before, you need to deploy equipment, you need to get it back, and then you need also to have the observations afterwards. So yes, it demands a huge amount of time, information, first background information on the area you're working and also after you've been working in the area. And yes, it's very difficult to get a research vessel for this amount of time or to guarantee that you would have the ship time to do all of the observations you're supposed to do. So yes.
From what I understood, there haven't been enough countries to actually ratify this, so it did not become international law. And then there are like some countries like Germany that ratified it, and they would still have to create like a local law, so their parliament would have to vote on it. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but some lawyers told me that this is more like a recommendation that has the effect of a law. And since this recommendation was given, no scientific institutes did any ocean iron fertilization studies anymore. But technically, it's not really a legal barrier. It's more like a recommendation barrier that then was taken very seriously. And countries that didn't ratify it, for example, like the United States, they wouldn't have any issues not complying with it. It's more like countries like Germany that ratified it now believe that they have to follow the rules. Although even Germany didn't introduce any legislation that was specific to it. So in some sense, it's not a real law, but it has the effect of a real law towards the scientific resources, which is quite sad in my point of view. And I wonder if what would be required to change it, to change like Germany's point of view, for example, to say, actually, maybe we should step away from our ratification or add like certain exceptions so that it could comply again with the ship time. Like if we were to reform the London Protocol to make it more realistic, how could we do it? And how could we ask for it for politicians? Maybe there's now a new government in Germany and we can say, hey, we need some changes to do science.
Yeah, I think in the end it needs a change of attitude, but also from scientific community, because in order to change that, you need stakeholders that they all get together and say, okay, this has to change because we need to push that forward. And as long as you don't have that consensus, it's going to be difficult. So you need a general consensus. And the problem is, like you said, the public opinion, but also a lot of scientists are against this type of studies. And I think slowly people are changing, but we're not there yet. For instance, a lot of the initiatives now that deal with carbon sequestration, they are more focused on ocean alkalinization, or for instance, these microalgae farms. And then you tell them, but you know that if you add olivine to the ocean, you're adding iron. Or let's say, if you want to cultivate microalgae in the open ocean, you also have to add iron. I really had this with a funding agency where I wrote a proposal for my study, and they answered me, ocean iron fertilization is interesting, but we're not doing that right now. They refused it because they say we don't support OIF. And then I think I wrote them and I said, listen, all of your other options, they involved iron fertilization, one way indirectly or indirectly. And they answer, yeah, it's interesting. And we'll think about it for the future. That was it.
I wonder, does the iron become bioavailable if you add like olivine material?
Well, yes, of course. Part of it, yes. I mean, that has been also modeled already. One of the first studies on that, which are model studies, they also showed that the addition of iron through olivine has also a significant impact. So it's a combined impact.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
so the objective of this podcast is to change people's minds. So the objective of this podcast is to communicate the possibilities of ocean iron restoration to young people, explain the connection with the whales, and reframe it in a way that actually gets consensus. So maybe the geoengineering angle that can't get consensus. Let's say you take a sample of 1,000 people and you explain to them, we used to have more iron because of the whales, we killed the whales, now we need to put more iron in to balance out what we took out because of the whales. A majority of the people would actually say, okay, actually, that's a good idea. We intervened and now we need to fix what we intervened. And our hope is by talking to researchers like you and Smattercheck and others active in the field that we can get this message out to as many people as possible and basically create a shift in mindset that says, let's restart this research. And we have the resources, we have the boats, we have the money. There's so much science being conducted. Why isn't this type of science being conducted? And it's sort of a community that maybe was very early in the 2000s with OIF, that was before all the other solutions that come up now, was sort of the one that was most researched or that had the biggest hopes. And then 12 years ago, it just stopped, unfortunately. And there's no reason for it to stop in at least our point of view.
Yes.
It must go on. There must be more of it rather than less of it. And I wonder what the mechanism is in the scientific community, because typically human behavior is driven by incentives. There's always like an incentive why you do something. And sometimes the incentive is financial, sometimes the incentive is fear, and then very few times the incentive is love. But I think these are like the three things that drive human behavior. And I wonder, all the scientists that are opposing scientific research around ocean iron restoration, what is the incentive in the scientific community to oppose it? Is it that being the voice of opposition gets you more research funding and gets you more media attention, more of a profile? Or is it the voice of cautiousness, basically being how a scientist is wired and trained? You always need to oppose propose your own ideas in order to be credible, or is it some other angle? It's really something that is very novel to me because I come from the industry, I don't come from science. Typically in the industry, there's no opposition against your own research. And in ocean iron fertilization, there's people that are experts on ocean iron fertilization, but they are also opposing it. So they're kind of like double agents. They have all these publications on it, like an authority. They've researched the stuff for like 20, 30 years, but they still say it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be happening. And I really wonder what makes those people choose that strategy in science. Like, I'm against it, but I'm an expert in it and I love to study it, but it shouldn't happen. So it's sort of like legal to talk about it. It's legal to study it, but it's illegal to do it. Doing it, it's somehow evil. It shouldn't really be done.
It's fear and being cautious. Because first, there is a difference between experiments and really going now to the Southern Ocean and spreading iron all over the place. But the problem is, at the time this research was started, there was no regulation on this kind of activities. There was also a period where climate science was attacked massively, and I think people got scared that private companies would just now go there, throw iron without scientific background, without scientific verification, and make a business out of it. So people are very careful and a bit worried about talking too openly about that. There are also the issues of we don't know how effective that is still. We have indication that it could be effective, but we're not 100% sure. So it's more caution, basically, and fear, I would say. Fear of opening the Pandora box, you know what I mean? As somebody who has done these experiments, I see that differently. I see that as an opportunity to learn more about the system. I don't see that as a threat to the Antarctic ecosystem. These areas are not in DEZ, so there is no regulation. There is no way you can also supervise this area. I mean, anybody can go there and do whatever they want. Who's gonna check what you're doing in those areas? And so people are worried about what's going to happen in these areas given the current climate.
I think fear is a great point. It's also science is a lot about quantification. You're part of the sort of quantification step of the process. And then the reward is often in the quantification in the scientific community, and it's not necessarily in the scaling of a system. Though if you flip this around, I think Edison had like a proposal for an electric car. I read that in his biography. But then the most famous electric car entrepreneur is the guy who was like an investor in an electric car company with like Elon Musk, and then like who scaled up and probably had like a positive climate impact with that. So I wonder if there's also something we can offer the scientific community. I mean, it's John Martin's iron hypothesis, but maybe it could be another scientist's continuation of the work and scaling of the work, and that there's also a lot of benefit for humanity and glory and recognition, that it's not only about just studying it, but also someone needs to grow it, needs to make it a reality, and not only like a theory.
The issue is how it's regulated, how it's checked, and what's it used for. Because if you're doing that, it's an interference on a planetary level. I mean, even if it's the Southern Ocean, it's a huge chunk of our ocean that you're playing with. And if you're doing that, you have to be sure that you're not harming, or at least that the benefits are higher than whatever side effects you might have, and then you're not doing worse by doing it. There needs to be a good framework for how the experiments are done, what the verification is, and how you distribute the benefits of these experiments also. That's the other thing. It's about justice, and we don't have this framework yet, I think. And maybe that's why also a lot of scientists are very reticent to talk about it. And I think the London Convention was a step in that direction, but we need a better framework that allows it to be feasible and still properly checked and managed. I think if you would have a framework like that, scientists also would feel more relaxed about it. But we don't have that, because those are international waters.
It seems to be that in, for example, ocean alkalinity enhancement, there's more money, more teams working on more resources. Though in my humble research opinion, there's like this limit of carbon removal. You have sort of like roughly a ratio of 1:1 between alkaline material and carbon export. So it doesn't really compare with OIF, where you have like ratios of 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000, or maybe even more if you find the right locations. So somehow people are more comfortable with the idea of mining a mountain and then sinking a mountain in the ocean just for the pure benefit of carbon removal. And I don't know of any other good ecosystem benefits. So there's not going to be whales coming back. And somehow that's preferred by the scientific community as a form of also geoengineering, if you will, rather than using biology. So why are people so scared about biology, but chemistry in the ocean is somehow not scary?
You're right, I think. The difference is that first, ocean iron fertilization is the Southern Ocean, which is, in the view of a lot of people, a very pristine area. It's not, but that's how people see it. It's also an area where you can't control what's happening, whereas ocean alkalization is more done in coastal areas. Legally, these are the exclusive economic zones, which means you don't have the same issues. The other thing is in our coast, we are already shifting sediments, huge amount of sediments, by building infrastructure, building harbors, and so on. So I think there's a bit of a different perception when it comes to these two things. But yeah, it's not completely rational. I mean, I agree with you. It's not really rational.
Yeah, well, that's why we love to give out this number. So I always emphasize the 1:1 ratio, where this is the 1 to thousands ratio. And again, I think if you were to ask a representative sample of the population, if you ask 1,000 people, most would probably argue that OIF is the much better solution. You should first do OIF, and then if OIF is not enough, maybe you should try to do OAE. In general, I believe everything should be explored and quantified. I think science should get the permit and resources to do experiments in both. But my humble opinion is OIF should get more. And right now it's getting very little.
Yeah, because of the bad press.
In some sense, the work that you're doing is like natural OIF, and OIF is sort of the category. How much other research is happening in OIF? Like, what do you think is like the combined global budget of research that is looking into this? Are you kind of only sort of your team, or is there more?
I think Micros was one of the very few ones that did that. I know the study of the French in Kerguelen, this was long ago. There was a study in Crozet, but really looking at it from that perspective, I don't know of any other studies.
I only know those studies that look at the blooms from satellite.
Sorry, I thought you were referring to Crozet. I don't know about the other studies, but I was referring to Crozet. As far as I know, we're the only ones. After Kerguelen, I don't know of any other studies. I mean, there may be others, but I don't know about them.
The difficulty with just satellite imagery is that you don't really know much about the biology, the export. You just see the bloom from space. You just combine like chlorophyll, basically, levels with some kind of iron source. I think in the coast of South America, next to Patagonia, you have one of the best iron sources, and you have a lot of squid.
This is the Patagonian shelf, exactly. So this is an interesting area also for studies because the conditions are a bit different. So it's further north, so it's subantarctic waters. Probably the nutrient composition is also different. So yes, and this is definitely a naturally fertilized area, massive area, which is extremely interesting. I also think it should be studied more. I don't know of many studies there. Practically none, as far as I know. I mean, so yes, definitely. Very interesting area.
If I'm like an environmentalist and I want to point towards an area where like natural OIF is happening and it's thriving, the ocean food web is thriving, I would point to this area and say, hey, more areas of the ocean could be like this area. And this is a wonderful area. There's like the biosphere is doing really, really well.
Yes. Yes. This is another example. I can't focus on everything, but this would be a really an area of focus in this respect.
If there would be a Netflix documentary that has a global audience of 100 million people, this may change people's minds. If we were to show in a Netflix documentary, which is titled sort of Ocean Iron Restoration, and then one episode shows the natural OIF studies, and then the case in the human mind would become very clear, like, oh, wait, this is amazing. This is really, really positive. And then sometimes I wonder that maybe the visuals are missing. Maybe you need the beauty of the ocean with iron needs to be shown. And then also the deserts in the ocean that don't have iron also need to be shown. And then you need to compare the two and tell people, this is what you'll get with iron, this is what you have without iron. And one of the objectives of this podcast is to try to show these visuals and try to work towards a path of giving this to a larger audience.